In this video, we're going to be talking about Javadoc. Javadoc is a tool developed by Sun Microsystems used to develop detailed documentation for the Java programming language. Now, Sun Microsystems is the company that originally developed Java. Java got bought out. It's owned by a company called Oracle currently, but that's when Javadoc was available. It was pretty early on. In source code, Javadoc appears as a type of comment used mainly for constructors and methods. So this is going to be under a category of comments. You might have actually seen this word on your rubric. Now that we are learning Javadoc, it'll be something that gets required in our labs and projects. But here is our syntax. We have a /**, and then I have effectively any number of asterisks, as this slide kind of shows. We can add more if we need them. And then we have an asterisk and another / to close it out. Now this looks an awful lot like a multi-line comment. It's different, right? This extra asterisk here makes a big difference. In a Javadoc, we can have tags. These are called annotations actually, such as @param and @return to label information within the Javadoc comment. These tags are detected and applied whenever the API is generated, which we're actually going to generate an API today, and you'll see what I'm talking about with these things. Here's some context. I'm going to write this Javadoc, and it's going to apply to, in this case, a constructor. I know this is a constructor because we don't have a return type, even though I can't see a class header. Right? In theory, the constructor name should match the class header. That's not enough evidence. I can't see the class name. I know this is a constructor because there's no return type. This particular constructor takes in two parameters, a string indicating the name and an integer that indicates the student number. Okay? And then we use some this dot notation in order to assign those values. What's important here are these two tags, these two annotations. We see @param name, that's referring to this variable, the student's name. So it's clarifying what this parameter is. Here we see @param student number. That's referring to this integer. This is the student's school identification number, right? So this is a comment, but it's a little bit more techy, right? We got these tools coming in here that help us kind of specifically talk about these parameters. Here, this particular thing, here I have a method. Well, method has return types, and so we see the @return annotation or tag, right? This method will return true if this student has the same name and student number as other. This is an equals method. The idea behind it is that I'm going to determine if two students are equivalent, if they're equal. In this case, they have the same name and student number. That's not important. What's important is we see these two tags, including this @param annotation tag, which is referring to other. The student object, this student, will be compared against. Okay? Additionally, a Javadoc comment should contain a brief explanation of the constructor or method. So we've seen those tags, those annotations, but it's also a good idea to generally talk about what this does. This constructs a new student using the specified name and student number. That's pretty simple because this constructor is pretty simple, but you could imagine some pretty complex scenarios where a good solid comment helps out there. Okay, here's the equals method, right? And here we see our @param @return, but I have this general description. Compares this student to the specified student. The result is true if this student's name is equal to the specified student's name and if this student's number is equal to the specified student's student number. Otherwise, the result is false. Don't worry too much about what's going on with those methods. All I really want to show you is comments and the uses of those, these Javadoc comments. Here is the payoff. Javadoc is unique as API, that is Application Programming Interfaces, documentation can be generated directly from Javadoc comments. And then modern IDEs such as IntelliJ can auto-generate API documentation from those comments. Before doing so, I recommend creating a folder to store the files created from the Javadoc generation tool. So here's what we need to do first. Let's bring up something. Here I have student. I'm going to apply some Javadoc comments to things like constructors and methods. Okay? So what we're going to do is let's tackle maybe this constructor, right? This is a very broad constructor as it takes in 4 parameters. Above this constructor, I'm going to add in a Javadoc comment. Okay. In IntelliJ, if you just do /**, that's the beginning of the comment, and hit enter, boom, it's going to partially generate this Javadoc comment. And we see @param first, @param last, ID, GPA. It's pulling that information from here. It's referring to these parameters, these instance variables. Okay? So what this does is it gives me an opportunity to elaborate on these type of things, right? First is the student's first name. Right? Last is the student's last name. And I know these are pretty self-explanatory to us, but imagine you're not exactly sure what this is, right? I did take a shortcut and call this first and not first name. I took a shortcut and called this last, not last name. Maybe somebody needs that explanation, right? ID is going to be the student's ID number, student's identification number, school identification number. Maybe this is a good opportunity to give an example. Maybe it's just some numbers. Notice that there's a lack of special characters in here, right? In the case of school ID numbers, they are generally just numbers. But, for me as an employee, my ID actually has numbers and letters in it. So something like that would be good to kind of give an example of. GPA. This one I think is actually going to benefit the most because we get the opportunity to say what our GPA scale is. In some systems, it's just 0 to 4, right? In some systems, like ours, is actually 0 to 5, right? So this is the student's grade point average on the scale 0 to 5. Right? And notice that we have brackets on either side. This is saying 0 inclusive. You could have a 0 GPA, or you could have a full-fledged 5, just as an example. But what I really want to highlight is we have the opportunity to kind of talk about GPA here. Right? Trying to comment it here is kind of awkward. But being able to reference it here directly with this @param tag, and then comment on what the actual scale is actually pretty nice. This particular constructor constructs a new student object given first, last, ID, and GPA. It's hard to get very descriptive with constructors at this level because all they're really doing is assigning values. They're initializing the instance variables for us. And so it's not a big deal. But imagine you're programming like a video game and the constructor, which is basically starting the game, there's a lot that can go into that. There's a lot that can go into a constructor that is responsible for establishing the setup of your game. So here we have a Javadoc on a constructor. I'm going to go through and maybe comment or Javadoc something else. Right here we see a getter. For first. Again, I'm going to do /*** and hit enter in IntelliJ, and it's going to plug in this stuff. Okay? You could apply a description here, but what I tend to do in practice is things like these getters where it's just simply returning. There's really no need for an explanation of the method because the explanation can happen with this @return tag. @return, the student's first name. That's it. Let's look at this setter. Again, I'm going to do /**, hit enter. In this particular case, we don't have a return. And so IntelliJ is smart enough to know not to include a return tag. Up here with this getter method, this accessor, we did. We were returning a string. So we are returning the student's first name. Here, no return type. Okay, so @param first, the new first name. Maybe it's a good description, and maybe this one actually warrants a description of what the method is. Update the student's name to first. Update the student's first name to first. Okay. What's kind of nice about this consistency, right, having this parameter and then talking about it here, is that in the comment, I'm obliged to talk about the variable. I can just say first here, updates the student's first name to first. What is first? This thing. Right? So that makes it a little bit easier to talk about it, right? I could say something like the specified variable, and that gets messy, particularly whenever you have multiple variables, multiple parameters coming in. Okay, so these are some examples. We see a Javadoc comment on the constructor. We see a Javadoc comment on the on an accessor. Here's a Javadoc on a mutator, and so we see the differences between those. In theory, I would do this on almost all these things. Maybe our getters and setters are so simplistic that it's not warranted, but you could imagine a pretty advanced method performing lots of actions, actually requiring a Javadoc, and a Javadoc comment actually being really nice. We're going to see in just a moment why these things are drastically different from your typical comment, right? This just, to me, looks an awful lot like a multi-line comment with extra steps, but we're going to see the true benefit in just a moment. The toString is a good one to actually comment, because this returns a string representation of the student object, and this is where I would typically do some type of like format representation, or some example of how the format should look. Representation of the student object in the format, right? First, last, ID, and then GPA. And maybe you want to indicate that this is actually a variable. Oh no, we don't want to do that, because that's we could do this. As we're about to see on the back end, maybe I'll just show you, then I'll come back and talk about these. I'm going to put these tags around my variables here. Okay. Some of you may already, you got buzzer going off, you know what this is going to do, or you have an inkling of what's about to happen. But so this toString method returns a string representation of the student object in the format first, followed by our first, last, ID, GPA. So maybe this is a good spot to kind of give an example, or list out the actual format of what the person should expect. So these are Javadoc comments. Again, they kind of just look like multi-line comments. I'm going to show you the payoff, because as this talks about, modern IDEs such as IntelliJ can auto-generate API documentation from these things, from these Javadoc comments. And the slides go on to say, what I first recommend is you make a folder to export this stuff to. I'm going to right-click on my student project, and then I'm going to, somewhere in here, should be able to make a new, at the very top, make a new directory. So I right-clicked on my student project folder. We're going to do new directory, and I'm going to refer to that as simply doc, obviously short for documentation. Now I have a good spot for my Javadoc documentation to end up in. So we went through, we made that folder. The next thing we're going to do is go to Tools, Generate Javadoc. Back in IntelliJ, Tools, Generate Javadoc. Okay, a lot of stuff that you can play with here. I wouldn't worry too much about it. The thing you need to focus on is our output directory. Where do you want this documentation to end up? I'm going to click on that bad boy, and it is in the current folder that we're working in, which is student. I created this doc folder. So I'm going to navigate to that doc folder. I'm going to highlight it. I'm going to hit OK. So that's where I want my output directory. The other thing that's potentially interesting is this slider over here where you can change the access level of stuff to be documented. What am I saying? You could change it to private. What does that mean? It's going to document or is going to include information about things that are private. That's not normal. Normally, we only document or talk about, we only explain to other people the things that are effectively public, right? The things that they should say. See things like our public interfaces that we've done before. You could change it so that it's private so that things like your instance variables show up in that documentation. Let's go ahead and slide it to private and you'll see what I'm talking about. Again, this is not normal. This is not typical. Normally we just leave it to protected/public. But I'll go ahead and slide that to private so you can see the changes. So all I did was change my output directory and then mess with this slider to include private, and I'm going to hit OK. IntelliJ is going to do its thing. It finished, and whoa, immediately opened this. What is this? This is what I'm talking about. This is what we made. Take a look. Class, student. Field summary. Another word for field is variable, instance variables, right? We see a string first. We see a double GPA, an int ID, a string for our last. These are our instance variables. The only reason we're actually seeing them is because I slid that thing to private, but you could include that if you feel like it's important for someone that's using your class. Constructor summary. These are our 3 constructors. Sweet. Look at this description. Constructs a new student object given first, last, ID, and GPA. Where did that come from? Right here. Right here is that bad boy. Okay. Our method summary. Here we see a description over here. And if I actually hop down to the constructor that I Javadocked, right? I only Javadocked one of them. Constructs a new student object given first, last, ID, and GPA. First, the student's first name. GPA, the student's grade point average on a scale 0 to 5. That's coming straight from the Javadoc comment. That's the point of these things. That's the real benefit of doing Javadoc, is that you can generate these things. And I hope this looks familiar to you, because guess what? No, not JavaScript, sorry. You're too smart, IntelliJ. You've seen it before. I hope it looks familiar to you. You've seen it before, okay? In order to create this, they didn't write this HTML page. They just commented the stuff and had the tools automatically document it, right? Very, very similar stuff here. Now, I said something about the little tags that I did in here. Right? These things. Take a look. My formatting here is not great. But ultimately, what this tool did whenever we generated our Javadoc, we generated an HTML page, is what it is. And this is an HTML tag, right? Oh yeah, we did some HTML in computer science principles. And so this is the tag that italicizes the thing. It's in my Java code, but ultimately it gets used whenever we Javadoc, whenever we generate the Javadoc API stuff, and it ends up being italicized here on the back end. On a related thing, I'm going to try something. Bear with me. If we're going to have it show up in our HTML, I'm going to use an HTML tag, this break, which should cause a line break. In order to change that, I probably have to run my tools again. Super easy. Are you going to launch it again, or do I need to refresh? We'll refresh, and I hope those things end up on new lines, and they do. I would probably want to put this one on a new line as well. Okay, so here's my point. These comments, these Javadocs, they're better than normal comments because we get more stuff out of them. We get the ability to generate these APIs on the fly. There was some red in there. We'll just ignore that. And these are pretty nice. Like, I can hand someone this documentation, which is in HTML. They can just load it in any browser, or I could, publish this to the internet. And if they want to use my class, they can refer to this documentation. In theory, I would do a lot more kind of commenting and talking about what the actual class does and that sort of thing. But boom, yeah, it's a Javadoc comment. Let's see what the rest of our slides have to say. There's some images in here on how to generate those things and talking about, finding your document folder and sliding that thing. In addition to those @param and @return tags, you will also see in the Javadoc comment preconditions and postconditions of a method. A precondition is a set of guidelines that a method assumes are met before the method is invoked. You're going to like these. Here's an example. I got this equals method, right? And we say a precondition. Other is not null. We don't really know what null is at the moment. So it doesn't mean a whole lot to us, but this one, it should make a lot of sense. Right? Here I see sqrt, a square root method. Precondition, x is greater than 0. What happens if x is 0 or negative? Right? Our square root function kind of falls apart. Our square root method falls apart. And so here I'm saying precondition. We're assuming x is greater than 0. Here I have a method spoonify. This is really awesome. I'm a big fan. It creates something known as a spoonerism. It's where you take the first characters in a set of 2 words and you swap them. I'll have to find some examples. Anyway, so what this does is it takes those 2 strings and it swaps the first 2 characters. That's all. But we have a precondition here that the length of str is greater than 0, right? And the length of str2 is also greater than 0. I need to have a character in order for this to work. And what this precondition is saying is that we're assuming that this is true. Right? I've got these 2 parameters, and this is actually a description where it talks about swapping these things, and ultimately what's returned is a string with a space and blah, 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 blah. Here is a max method, which finds the maximum in an integer array, except there's a precondition. More on this in a little bit. There's a precondition. A, this array, is sorted in ascending order. We're going to return the largest value in A. Preconditions exist in the context that it's nearly impossible to account for every possible scenario a method could encounter. Instead of attempting to define methods that anticipate unthinkable scenarios, preconditions work as a contract that says if you want to use this method, you need to abide by the specific guidelines. Here's what the preconditions are saying. My precondition here is saying, I am not going to write code that tests for this. I am not, as a programmer, even going to check X to make sure this is true. I'm going to write my code assuming this is true. I'm going to put this precondition in there, and it is up to the people that use my method not to do something stupid, like use a 0 or a negative number when they use my code. I am not going to test the lengths of these strings. Instead, I'm going to put this precondition here telling users that if you're going to use my spoonify method, don't use a string with a length of 0. You're not going to be happy. I'm not checking for it. I'm asking that you just don't be stupid. Okay, that is the idea behind a precondition. And we maybe encountered similar situations before. I think whenever we were talking about like the mass of a dog, right? I told you how you can basically apply if statements to check to make sure that, the weight or the mass of the dog is a positive number. Instead, I would kind of write these getters and setters with preconditions, I'm not going to waste my time writing code that checks for these type of things. There are some scenarios that are just unthinkable, and I'm asking you that you provide me like good values whenever you're using my methods. A postcondition, on the other hand, is what the method should return provided the precondition is met. So let's look at some examples. This first one's not great, but we have a postcondition of what you should expect given that the precondition is met. What you should expect my condition or my method to return. Right? Postcondition is you should expect 1.0 if x is 1.0. Otherwise, some double. This is not a great example. This one I do think is a great example. right? If you use my spoonify method and you meet this precondition, you should expect a string with a length of at least 3. Why is that? Well, if you have one character for the first string and one character for the second string, I'm going to insert a space. So you should expect back at least a string with a length of 3 or more. And you should expect at least one space. That's what this postcondition is saying, right? That's a little bit different. It's a little bit more general than what the literal return statement is saying. It's kind of these are what you should expect. Okay. My favorite max method, right? Keep in mind, we're taking in an integer array that I'm assuming is sorted, and what I'm ultimately returning you, the largest value in A, it's the last element. I'm going to give you the last element out of the array because it's sorted, and that's the maximum value. That's big brain. Ultimately, all the information that can be in a Javadoc comment is optional. You do not have to write Javadoc comments for the AP Computer Science A exam for this course. You do not need to write them. However, you do need to be able to interpret them. I should probably rephrase that. I expect Javadoc comments because they're good comments. To me, Javadoc comments are better than your end-of-line, single-line comments. They're better, definitely better, than your multi-line comments. And so I expect Javadoc comments in our programming assignments. Okay? You can use them to hit your 5 comment soft rule that I have. But I expect Javadoc comments, and that doesn't mean that I don't want you to use end of line or end of line comments, single line comments anymore. You should still use those things because they are good for hitting specific context, right? Javadoc comments apply to like the method or constructor as a whole. But the single line, end of line comments provide, ability to comment just a single specific section of a code, just a single specific line. And so they should still be used. I expect to see all sorts of comments in our programming assignments. That's going to be it for Javadoc. I'll see you in the next one.